The United States is considering military intervention into Venezuela. Is the story as simple as it seems, or is there another side to it? Join me today on Roundtable Perspective when I interview Dr. Lee Artz on media framing and the Venezuelan crisis. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Lee Artz. We're going to discuss the crisis in Venezuela from a media analysis perspective. Lee, you've published several articles on this. You've visited Venezuela. Give us a quick rundown on what you think is happening right now, and we can go from there.
Well, I guess the hardest thing is when we talk about media coverage, the distortion is just baffling to me. The extreme distortion from the New York Times to ABC News about what events are happening in Venezuela. So we'd have to step back a little bit to have a discussion about the U.S. is talking about possible military intervention. The U.S. has raised sanctions against Venezuela. The U.S. has raised recognition of an interim president. So there, and the way that the public understands it is the way it's being presented. But when you know about Venezuela, or you understand what the process is in Venezuela and what the public is going through in Venezuela, there seems to be a complete disconnect between what the Tribune or the Chicago papers or the New York Times are writing and what's actually on the ground.
And how it's being interpreted in other nations in South America. So, I mean, essentially we have two different versions of reality here, right? One view says that Maduro is the rightfully elected president, and the other view of this is that Guaido is also the rightfully elected president, even though he wasn't elected by the official process. We've also got a constitution that was being worked on before Maduro took office, as I understand, and then he tried to implement after he got in, and so there's some question as to what the process should be. And the United States is saying that the second person who was elected president is the real president, and Maduro and I think other South American leaders are saying that Maduro is the president, and the United States is threatening to send military forces in to.
Even before that, the United States has been actively intervening in Venezuela for more than 2 decades, which is not something that's known by the public, but certainly. And the reasoning is that there's a humanitarian crisis.
Which we created to some extent, right? Because we're boycotting their oil, and they're not bringing in the income that they normally brought in from oil, and therefore they've got hyperinflation. And
well, it's interesting. If we learn things about media framing, we should know since the first Iraq War that usually the argument for U.S. military action has to do with some humanitarian crisis. That was true in Haiti, it was true in Honduras, it was true in
the Kuwait story about
the Kuwait story, Iraq,
Iraqi
Afghanistan.
soldiers dumping the babies out of the incubators, which was fabricated.
So you have to, for the public consumption, and I would say the U.S. government's kind of faced with they're involved in a quagmire in Afghanistan, still in Iraq. There was a recent attempts to be involved in Syria. So the idea that you want to tell the American people, well, now we have to turn our attention to, that's a difficult sale. So you kind of have to create the conditions for that. What we call that agenda setting in media theory, right? The media presents enough things that it becomes something that the public says, oh, we should address this, we should think about this. And that's kind of where we are at this point.
Just to contextualize it a little bit, if somebody's not quite as familiar with it, you know, one way I think to put it, maybe this oversimplifies it, but essentially the United States is more powerful than any of these other countries that we're talking about here, arguably the most powerful country in the history of the world. If the American public supports our government sending troops in somewhere, we're going to tip the scales to whichever side we come in on. So if you are in Venezuela, you don't have to just manage the the perceptions and keep the people informed in your country, you need to be concerned about the perceptions of people in the United States, because if we decide that we need to come in and get involved, we're going to do that, and we're going to override whatever processes or defense systems you had, essentially. And we can look at what happened when we went into Serbia and and a bunch of other places,
or
right?
Haiti or Honduras most recently, where the U.S. supported coups. I mean, the U.S. Marines went to Haiti, put Aristide on a plane and flew him to Africa. And they supported the coup in Honduras, where they arrested the elected president, put him on a plane and flew him to Costa Rica. So yes, I mean, a big part of that is the recognition that the U.S. and the U.K. and Canada and much of the EU has for Juan Guaido as the interim president. But that's, again, it's almost like something out of some fantasy movie. This is a person that was not elected. He was not elected president of the National Assembly.
Right.
He was a deputy, alternate deputy to the National Assembly for 10 years.
Right.
The recent election, he got 26% of the vote.
Right.
So he was the second person to represent Vargas. The only reason he's the president of the National Assembly is the opposition parties have an agreement that they will rotate seats. And it was the time for Popular Will, which is a right-wing confrontational party, their turn to become the president of the National Assembly. Well, their leader, Leopoldo Lopez, is under arrest for violent behavior. The second person in Popular Will ran to Chile because he was charged with violence against citizens. Now Juan Guaido, who had 26% of the vote in his home province, suddenly becomes the president of the National Assembly, but nobody elected him at any stretch. And when you ask Capriles, who was the last candidate for president to run against Maduro, he says none of the opposition parties support Guaido. There's one important supporter of Guaido. That's the United States.
I mean,
that's the United States. I mean, Mike Pence called him on the phone on January 22nd. Mike Pence called up Juan Guaido and said, "Would you like to be president of Venezuela?" The next day, the next morning, Guaido gets on TV and says, "I am now president of Venezuela," and the U.S. and Canada and the U.K. all recognize him. But it has no relation at all to the last poll said that 80% of Venezuelans don't even know who he is.
I mean, and we'll get away from the politics of it in a second, but so essentially this would be like Hillary Clinton claiming she's president of the United States right now, because even though Trump got elected according to the Constitution,
she had the majority of the popular vote.
Actually, she has a better claim to be president than Guaido has of claiming to be president of Venezuela.
And technically, Trump only got 31% of the electorate to vote for him.
So
yeah, somebody could make that claim.
So there's a battle over the perceptions of the citizens of the United States here, right? And
well, yes.
So
but
how is that fought? I mean, how are the pro Maduro people making a good argument in the United States? Are they?
No, because there is no access to the commercial media in the United States. There's no access to Fox, ABC, NBC, CNN. There's no access to the New York Times.
Could they buy ads? Could they buy full-page ads in the New York Times?
Perhaps, but part of what's happening is
because they send somebody to go on the talk shows.
They could, but the U.S. sanctions disallows the sale of Citgo Petroleum. The UK sanctions disallow the access to Venezuela to the gold that they have stored in British banks. The U.S. sanctions disallow Brazil from paying the debt that they owe to Venezuela for electricity. So that the economic sanctions means that they don't have the funds that belong to them available. In fact, recently the U.S. government says, we're going to take all those funds and give them to this guy named Guaido. It'd be like me saying, Tom, you're not an honest person, and I'm going to give all your funds to another person in another department. And if I'm the bank, I can do that. I cut you off and put all the money in their account.
So why aren't we hearing this from the American news media?
Well, there's an acceptance by the American news media that the U.S. officials are the most informed about conditions in Latin America.
Right. There's Edmund's theory about expert sources, all being educated at the same universities and all being current or former members of the core of officials that represent us at embassies.
And why would they lie to us? We learned from Iraq that they always tell us the truth. So why would we question whether the government does anything here?
But we have so many media outlets in the United States, right? I mean, there's people blogging on social media. We have
certainly you can read this on social media. It's not like I have a direct line to Orenco, newspaper in Venezuela. You can watch Democracy Now! Even on cable TV. There are Counterpunch, which is a mostly online news source. There are available sources, but they're few and far between.
So would you say that if somebody wanted to, they could look into this on their own and get a sense of what's going on?
They certainly could make that start. They certainly could make that start.
Well, here's another interesting question then. Why don't they? I mean, the premise is if we're a democracy,
there is no
citizens,
reason
we have
to.
this responsibility to know what's going on. I mean, why do you think
if you tell your kids that it's snowing outside, are they going to ask the person next door to get a second opinion because they trust you?
My kids probably would.
Right,
yeah.
but they would trust you. They understand, and there's no earthly reason why I wouldn't see this, because it's so prevalent in all the media. There must be an element of truth from it, and that's one of the ways that the media framing takes place. They don't cite actually sources. They will say things like, the last election where Maduro won 67% of the vote was widely considered fraudulent. By whom?
And they're doing that more than they used to. Particularly, I noticed the New York Times is doing a lot of consensus kind of reporting without actual, traditionally, what was considered objective evidence.
Yes, if you begin to open that, then that would prompt somebody's skepticism. But when you leave it on the general consensus building, and then you repeat this, or you say something like, it's selective sources. So you say the Lima Group, which represents 12 countries in Latin America, think that the Guaido guy should be the interim president. They don't tell you that the OAS, the Organization of American States, recognizes Maduro and considers Guaido the prelude to a coup. So they don't tell you that Mexico is in favor of dialogue, or Uruguay, or the Pope is in favor of dialogue.
I think even Russia called for dialogue on this.
Many, Turkey, I mean, there's many, but undoubtedly most of the EU and Canada and the United States and the countries in Latin America would prefer that what's happened in Venezuela over the last 20 years disappears. And that's also what the American people don't know. There is such a lack of information for the American public over what's happened in the last 20 years. You can't imagine, why would the U.S. be so concerned? Well, sure, there's oil, but it's more than oil. It's the changes that have happened to how democracy exists in a country that doesn't comport with how the United States likes to deal with representatives of countries in Latin America.
Well, and a lot of those differences between the Venezuelan system and the U.S. system have to do with how they had public discussion, how they used media, right? You're very familiar with that. There was a huge effort to provide public access to broadcast and things like that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I did some writing. I took a study abroad class there. I've been there a couple times. We met with all of the commercial private media. We met with some of the local media television stations and radio stations. Yes, Venezuela was one of the first countries in Latin America that constitutionally, in their constitution, it says 1/3 of the media is set aside for private interests, 1/3 for public and the government, and 1/3 for community media. And they're one of the few countries that provided funds and training for that community media. They currently have over 1,200 community media outlets, which means a city like Hammond would have 2 or 3 community radio stations that could broadcast at 10,000 watts. And these are stations that are run much like Roundtable Perspective. The people that live in the community decide what the programming is going to be, who's going to host, when it gets aired, and their productions, their video productions, then appear on national television and are shared nationwide. Now that raises...
Before we go on, I just want to point out that the United States was a little closer to that model
in the 30s.
30, 40 years ago, because we protected local radio stations and television stations to some extent from being bought out by conglomerates. But today we've got a situation where 2 or 3 holding companies basically own a lot of most of the local radio stations in most of the communities. So everybody's getting the same broadcast, as opposed to a local owner at least broadcasting things from his or her point of view, right?
Yeah, we don't even have local owners. There has been in recent years in the U.S.
I mean, I know there are places that do have some local ownership. For Hammond, Indiana, for instance.
And there is the low power FM initiative that the FCC did that allows for low watt 100-watt stations, so you
Yeah.
can have local,
Yeah.
but those are all outside
Yeah.
any population areas
Yeah.
because the private media
Yeah.
considers that too much of a competitive pull to have
And
small
yeah, and they have a lot of
stations.
influence. But the reason I bring this up is it's interesting. So we've got a situation in the United States where there's this framing that goes on that's presenting a controversial view, at least, of what's happening in Venezuela. But Venezuela itself has a system that really protects against something like this happening, right?
Well,
Yeah.
certainly Venezuela's still the largest TV station and El Nacional is the largest newspaper,
Yeah.
so it's still largely private media, but you're right, there's
Yeah.
a community media
Yeah.
that's locally based and people can listen to those and produce on those and they can get a totally different perspective that isn't available
Yeah.
to the average citizen in the U.S. And I would say this is one example of why the U.S. wants Venezuela to change.
Yeah.
Because that participation, that democracy,
It's threatening, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it interferes with your ability to cut wages, cut public education, cut health care. I mean, and these are things that have changed radically in the last 20 years in Venezuela. But the United Nations Security Council does not recognize Guaido. You won't read that in the New York Times.
Right.
The OAS doesn't recognize Guaido. You won't read it in the New York Times.
So let's get back to that for a second. So, how is it that all of these independent news reporters, publications, we talked about it a little bit. They have to interview, news reporting, the rules of objective journalism require that they interview experts, which means there's a limited number of people that can be interviewed. But there's more to that that's going on here. You told me once that you were having lunch when you were in Venezuela, and there was a New York Times reporter.
Oh, well, that was Nicaragua.
I'm sorry, it was Nicaragua.
Yes,
But
it's the same.
An interesting example
thing.
was in the restaurant with you, and then the next day you read that this person had reported.
An eyewitness report of a demonstration in front of the labor ministry, yes, and he wasn't there because...
Obviously he wasn't there because you were with him at the...
But he had a source that told him everything that happened, so I guess that's legitimate, yes, No.
So part of this is laziness? I mean, they're going with the individual reporters are going with the consensus of what's going on. Because I remember when I was a reporter, everybody wanted to go out and get a story that nobody else had. And I don't understand why there aren't, enterprising people out there who are coming up with contradictory stories.
Well, there will be with some alternative media, but it's not going to be with the Tribune or the ABC News because there is not a budget for investigative reporting and there is not a political will to have that. And we know recently that even a reporter that asked a very modest question of Trump was excluded from it, right? So as a reporter, nobody has to threaten you. You just know if I don't report in this way, I may not get this assignment again. So, and I also would say,
even in the especially in the United States.
Well, especially in the United
You get sent
States.
from the Kansas City Star to cover Washington D.C. You need to come up with an interview with the president maybe once a year, and if they deny you that interview, the newspaper might send somebody else out to see if they can get through, right?
And they're not going to give you the interview if they think you're not going to present them
So you
favorably.
agree to not ask certain questions, right? Yeah.
But one of the things that
I'm coming around on this, don't you think? We've argued about this before.
One thing I'd like to say when you talk about expert sources, it's also a question of who you decide is the expert.
Right.
Telesur, which is an initiative of Venezuela, Argentina, Cuba, Bolivia, and to some extent Brazil, is a Latin American-wide CNN. Telesur is Television of the South. They've got 46 reporters in 20 different countries. But they consider their primary sources citizens. So when they report on a story, they don't run to the government agency. They go to the community or they go to the labor union or they go to the indigenous groups and they tell their stories, which are as legitimate, right? If you were to talk about what's the consequence of U.S. Steel laying off 10,000 people, the New York Times or the Tribune would go talk to the head of the U.S. Steel or maybe a banker.
They have to.
Telesur would go talk.
You can't do the story without that.
Right, and Telesur would, but they also would go talk to the people that are being laid off or the people that are still working or the steelworkers union.
It's interesting that we do what you're calling for in sports all the time. I remember when the Cubs got into the playoffs this year, they were going around all the bars asking the other Cubs fans how it feels to have your team in the playoffs, and it was kind of boring to watch that. But I could see from a political standpoint, when something impacts everybody's daily lives, it makes perfect sense to me to interview the people whose lives have been impacted. Right?
And I would say the New York Times and ABC News does that. But what they do is they go to the communities where they are comfortable, or they go to the communities that have PR people that can provide them with a slick story.
Right.
So they will do voices of the people, but they will do voices of the people in the gated communities. They don't do voices of the people on the hillside in Patari.
Right.
One, they would not feel comfortable. There aren't as many white people there. And two, that's not considered legitimate. Those would be people that have a political perspective and a self-interest. But somehow the privileged students or the privileged class that Guaido represents and Popular Well represents, they'll talk English. They'll invite you into their house. They'll share a bottle of rum with you.
The PR person will make sure everything's
and so it's
comfortable and
it's
friendly.
It's not a manipulative conspiracy as much as it is a political and cultural comfort zone that both the reporters and certainly the news publishers are most comfortable with. Yes, that's absolutely true.
So if somebody's listening to this discussion right now and they want to test to see if what you're saying is correct or not, they can basically, just look for the next story in the New York Times or the Washington Post or
I would ask them
to do a little
bit. I would ask them to do a little bit more.
But I mean to test what we're saying about the news media and see if they're not all matching up, and ask themselves to what extent does this reflect the other side of the story? Because we used to believe that good objective journalism told both sides of the story. So based on what I know right now, if I were writing this story, I would say there were my lead sentence is there are two opposing views as to who's president of Venezuela. And one view holds that it's this, and the other view holds that it's that. But if the story comes out saying, there's only one president of Venezuela, then it's beginning by already drawing a conclusion that defies the objectivity standard.
I would even argue that to say that there's two presidents in Venezuela defies the objectivity standard. It'd be like somebody saying, well, Hillary Clinton won the electoral vote, or
that's
what was
because I'm more objective than you are. That's all.
No, but it directly relates to how you're going to position something. Somebody that was never elected to office, it's a violation of the Constitution, that has no recognition, is somehow considered. So that's why I'm saying.
I agree with you.
But I'm saying the American people, a reader of the newspaper, can simply ask the same question: is this the standard the U.S. and the New York Times has for General Sisi, who overthrew an elected government in Egypt, and is actually guilty of torture and guilty of censorship?
Well, we
and
can
the U.S. recognize, or Saudi Arabia.
We can have the same conversation about Ukraine right now. I mean, it's very parallel in a lot of ways. But I think more importantly here, before we close, is what does this say about our hopes to function as a democratic country in the United States if we don't have access to what's going on, right? I mean,
well, that's one of the reasons.
Does this happen over, and it's going to happen over and over again as we go into the future here, or
and
do you
I would
see
argue,
changes coming?
And that's why I would argue one of the important things the American people can do is demand U.S. hands off Venezuela, because it shows a model for how we can get media access and how important media access is to democracy. That we should have voice, we should have our own ability to investigate, our own ability to present our points of view and our interests, which we are not well served by the media that now is primarily one of entertainment and, I would argue, distortions.
Well, but the U.S. Congress has been lobbied for years by big business, basically to eliminate the rules.
The rules of FCC, yes.
Of the FCC, right? So, I mean, what hope do people have if they march and carry some signs around of changing all that? I mean, look at all the things that Congress said they were going to do, right? They were going to get rid of all of these loopholes about essentially lobbyists bribing Congress people, right? And it was defeated by the lobbyists, right? The lobbyists went in and defeated the legislation that was going to
Again, I would say that's one of the biggest threat that Venezuela poses, not the loss of oil, but a threat of a good example. Could you imagine if all of the school teachers in the U.S. followed the tradition of the West Virginia school teachers that last fall went on strike with the support of the students and the parents, and they won a contract and they won smaller class sizes? Venezuela is a country that did that, where the population said, we're no longer going to function like this, that we will control our neighborhoods, we will control our schools, we will control our health care, we will control housing. That's a threat to the existing social relations of production in the United States. And that's one of the things that, in my mind, why the New York Times, why ABC News, the rest, fall in line around the government perspective, because it's also their perspective. The other thing suggests that we actually can make decisions that affect our lives. We don't need to rely upon somebody else.
So what's the largest news source you can think of that maybe is providing a different perspective of things?
Well, I think you probably have to go internationally, but and there's also.
What about New York Review of Books, Mother Jones? I mean, there are some sources out there right now. We just quickly because we're
well,
wrapping up
I
here.
would say counterpunch.org, which is an online site. They also have a monthly magazine, but they have a daily report.
This won't get us investigated by the FBI if we start going to these sites or anything, I hope, right?
Well, you might. Yeah, I don't
Just
know
kidding.
I don't know what the FBI investigates nowadays, so I'm not sure.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Lee Artz for joining us today at Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.